Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 4, Lecture 3 on Empiricism, with the related readings being The Empiricist Theory of Knowledge by John Locke and The Origin of Our Ideas by David Hume. For those of you who are a dessert before dinner type folks and you haven't done the readings yet, yes, you are actually reading 2 for this lecture, and you'll see why when we get to things in a few more minutes. But just as a brief roadmap, our usual schedule, we're going to do recap and overview, make sure you still have the vocab down in case you've slept a few times since the last lesson. Then we're going to look at John Locke in quite a lot of detail, since he really gives the core of the empiricist view. Then we're going to do a brief amount of detail on Hume, and then get to our usual implications, food for thought, and possible problems in these views. So, before we get into the stuff in detail, let's do the recap. So in this unit, we're looking at issues of epistemology, that is, the theory and study of knowledge, and in particular, we're looking into issues related to knowledge of the world, and how we get it, and what sources of knowledge can we trust. And so far, we've named 3 possible answers to this kind of question: rationalism, empiricism, and skepticism. Rationalism being the view that at least some of our knowledge of the world is gained through reason alone, or a priori, in philosophical jargon. Empiricism is the view that that's a load of crap, and all of our knowledge of the world actually comes through sensory experience, through your multiple senses, and thus is gained a posteriori. Skepticism is the view that both of those are wrong, and you actually don't have any real knowledge about the world. Or, on some variants, it's impossible for you to have knowledge about the world. Now, last time around, we looked at a piece by René Descartes, who gave us really strong arguments for both rationalism and skepticism. In fact, he really gave a lot of arguments for skepticism, and one supposedly really strong argument against it for a rationalist point of view. He generally framed the main point of skepticism, raised a lot of possible challenges and questions, doubts like, it's possible that you're just hallucinating and dreaming everything and thus don't actually have any real knowledge at all. But then he gives an answer to these kinds of questions and doubts, these doubts that really you can't get away from. He gives a possible answer to this by saying that, well, the one thing you can know for certain is that you exist, and you can know this fact through reason alone. Therefore, we can use it as a foundation, a rationalist foundation for other beliefs. So, in the end, he gives a position that really is rationalist at its core, but just kind of gives the main arguments for skeptics to use in the future. Now, this go around, we're looking at the other position that we've not talked about yet, empiricism. And so we're going to look at 2 absolutely famous British empiricists, John Locke and David Hume. Both of these guys are really big deals in philosophy, just like Descartes is. You guys are getting the highlights, the MVPs of the philosophy world in this kind of class. And Hume, honestly, is a much bigger deal than John Locke. But since Hume's reading is so short in our book, and since he relies on so many of Locke's ideas, we're actually going to spend more time going over Locke's view and just look at the more new and inventive parts of Hume, at least as far as the theory of knowledge goes. Hume does a lot of really cool stuff. We just don't get it in our book. But either way, both of these guys are very famous British empiricists. John Locke was English, David Hume is Scottish. Both of these guys believe that knowledge comes from sense experience alone, at least ultimately, at its core. We can learn things through knowledge, but the ideas we use we can learn things through reason, according to these guys, but reason really is just manipulating ideas and things that we know from sense experience. So really, the root cause of all of our knowledge is sense experience. Now, Hume takes this position and runs with it to a much, stronger extreme than Locke does. Hume takes this empiricism so far that it actually starts turning a little bit into skepticism, and you'll see what I mean when we get to his view towards the end of the lecture. Now, like Descartes, both of these guys are from the modern period in philosophy. Locke wrote a little bit before Hume, but generally they were both writing in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 1700s, with Hume pretty much being solely the 1700s. And both of these guys were very familiar with Descartes, and of course also with Plato and Aristotle and the other folks we've read. Pretty much if they were born before 1900, they were aware of each other in this class. And just an interesting side note, John Locke is actually sort of a founding father of the United States. He was a really major influence on Jefferson, Washington, and the other founding fathers. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson writes that all human beings have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he's explicitly ripping off John Locke, who said that all human beings have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property. So maybe a slight improvement there, or at least a less materialistic variation there. But Locke is very present in a lot of the founding ideas of the United States. And you may not care about this at all, but this is an American university. I'm American. Majority of my students are probably American citizens, and I just think it's an interesting fact of history. So, good thing to be aware of. Another nice thing is that both of these guys are also excellent writers. Locke is abundantly clear and well organized. Hume has some of the best turns of phrase that you can find in all of philosophy. Like, although his stuff is going to sound a little old-fashioned and a little stilted to modern English-speaking ears, if you ever get a chance to just read Hume out loud, you'll actually find there's some really nice sort of poetic, grand phrases that he uses. But I will warn you, Hume in particular, and to a small extent Locke, both of these guys have a small tendency to repeatedly explain themselves. Now, while to a certain extent this is very good, it's very useful, it makes sure that they make themselves clear, it means that sometimes you can start to think that he's starting a new argument, when in reality he's rephrasing an argument that he's already talked about. So, just a fair bit of warning, go carefully through these readings, even though they're both very good writers. It's easy to lose track of what's being said. So, little more stuff about Locke. Our Locke selection comes from his famous work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And by understanding, he really means knowledge, the faculty of a human being to know things and understand things. And really, this book is, in a way, a systematic critique of everything Descartes stood for. Now, like Plato's Republic, it's organized into different books, basically chapters. And each one of these covers a different topic. In our selection, because it is a selection, it's a sampling of the things from a very large and thick book, we see a few different parts of this. So he starts off with an introduction where he lays out his overall goal and project, just like we do. And then in Book 1, he lays out and argues against a foundational rationalist idea. He's going to argue against against the idea that human beings have innate ideas. And by innate idea, I mean exactly that. An idea that human beings do not learn, but are instead born with. See, a lot of rationalists, Descartes included, believe that human beings are actually born with certain concepts already in their minds. Depending on which rationalist you're talking about, which ideas are involved are a little different. But for example, Descartes believed that human beings had innate ideas of themselves existing, of God's existence, and as part of that, that perfection is a real thing and is an existing thing. And the reason why he said this sort of thing is that, according to Descartes, human beings wouldn't be able to make sense of degrees of something, like something being more or less good, unless they had an idea of what the maximum of that thing was. So, we wouldn't be able to understand, this thing is better than that one, unless we had an idea of the best, most perfect thing ever. Because then we can start to say, well, this is less than perfect, but it's less than perfect than this other one. So Descartes was saying that we have certain innate ideas because that's the only way a human being could function the way that we do. Other rationalists said similar things about different topics. A later and truly important foundational figure in philosophy, Immanuel Kant, while not a rationalist, later would argue that human beings have innate concepts of space and time and a few other things, because without those we couldn't coherently think or organize our sense experience. So it's not uncommon for a few philosophers to think that human beings are born with certain concepts already in their minds. But Locke is going to really tear this idea apart. And so he devotes the entire first book of his essay to critiquing and showing that this idea is a bad one. In Book 2, Locke moves on to actually start an answer, well, if we don't have some innate ideas and if rationalism isn't true, how do we get our ideas? And he starts developing a theory of how we do learn things through sense experience. In book 4, he starts to show how we turn these ideas and these things that we learn, how we turn these into actual knowledge, and what it is he means by knowledge. And then in books 11 and 15, he's going to apply this system, in this theory, to subjects that Descartes ended up casting a lot of doubt on. That is, things relating to the external world outside of our own minds, as well as things like probability and belief, and like basically filling in the details of the theory. The books in between all of these are really important as well, but they cover topics that go a lot further than just our discussion of knowledge. Like Locke's got a chapter on the existence of God, he's got some stuff on ethics. The essay concerning human understanding really covers a lot of subjects, and we're just focusing on the epistemology stuff. So, let's start to look at all this in detail. So Locke's project is pretty much the same as ours. Let's just go through the arguments in order. Locke starts off by saying what his project is, and it's pretty much the same as what we're doing. He wants to examine human understanding and knowledge. And so he actually gives a roadmap kind of like we do. He says what it is he's going to do and in what order. And so then, when he actually gets to book 1, after, I guess, it's a few paragraphs in our selection, he's going to start by laying out the position that's often held by rationalists, that human beings have innate ideas. And like I was just telling you about, this is the idea that human beings are born with some concepts already in their minds. They may not be aware that they were born with them, and they may not be aware of what some of these ideas were. But, according to some rationalists, there are things we already know hardwired into our brains. In the case of Descartes, that, perfection is a thing. We may not ever think about it, we may not ever realize that we know it, but we have to have that idea, Descartes and others said, because that's the only way we could make sense of certain things. Nobody ever had to tell you that that's the way these things worked. Now, Locke thought this was a really stupid idea, and he goes through in book 1 and sort of systematically tears this down. For example, he goes through an argument that's not unlike some of our things regarding moral objectivism. Locke argues that if there were innate ideas, then there should be universal concepts that everyone knows. And that sounds like it's just rephrasing the same thing the rationalists said, but with one particular emphasis. These concepts would be universally, that is, everyone would agree that these concepts are true. But there's no such idea that everybody agrees on. It doesn't take very many surveys of human beings to find that we disagree with everybody about everything. You may find large groups of people that agree on the same types of things, but you'd have a hard time even getting everyone on Earth, to agree that the sky is blue, for example. Historically, some cultures didn't even have a word for blue. For example, the ancient Greeks didn't call the ocean blue or refer to the sky as blue. They actually would call the sea something like wine dark. Like they were referring to it as the color of wine. Or they were referring to the sky as being a lighter shade of the sea or something like that. They didn't actually have words or concepts for blue, so even something as basic as the sky is blue, you wouldn't get universal agreement on. Plus, there are always crazy people who disagree with things just because they believe otherwise, and while they may be very rare individuals, the fact that there are people that disagree with these kinds of things shows that this is not something that's just hardwired into our DNA. This isn't something that we're born with the way you would expect an innate idea to be spread around the world. So, since these concepts aren't universally known, then that's a pretty good argument that they're not innate. We're not born with them. You learn them at some other later point in life. Now, some rationalists try and avoid this argument by saying something like, well, maybe you're not born with the idea, but you're born with the capacity to have the idea. But at that point, Locke points out, you really don't have the idea anymore. You're talking about something else. So how real are the ideas that you're supposedly born with if they're just capacities, not actual ideas? So that's really not a solution to this. So Locke has now shown that innate ideas aren't a thing, and he's ruled out one of the major, rational solutions to that objection. So he's sort of systematically tearing down the rationalist point of view. So, he then moves on. If we don't have innate ideas, then how do we get some of our concepts? Even the rationalists agree that sense experience gives us most of our ideas. But what about the ones that we previously thought were gained through reason or innate ideas alone? How do we get those? Well, Locke argues that if human beings are born like blank sheets of paper, born tabula rasa, then we can receive ideas solely through experience. That is, if we're born as blank slates, that if we have nothing in our minds at all when we're born, then we can actually get everything we need as far as needing to explain human beings and what we know. We can explain all of that simply using sense experience. Simply by perceiving the world and by paying attention to the activities of our own minds, we can learn everything else we need, or everything else that we actually know. See, sensation, our human senses, give us certain qualities and concepts and ideas like hard, soft, red, round, large, small, all the different basic building blocks of everything we know. Sensation gives us those things just by soaking them in through the senses. But then reflection, the activities of our own mind, give us a lot of other things. They give us exposure to things like connection, relation, definition. They give us a lot of the relating concepts, a lot of the things that tie concepts together. And the more we know about those, by having exposure to both of those things, we can eventually, as human beings, put these little basic building blocks together enough to build up our more complicated ideas. Like, for example, this is something that's not in our reading, but it's an easy way to explain this way of thinking. If you suppose that human beings are a blank slate, that we only soak up things through experience, you might start to wonder, well, where do we get ideas of things that we never experience? Like, say, where do you get the concept of a unicorn? Well, if you break it down, human beings have experiences of horses, and we have the experience of things with horns. In order to get a unicorn, you just combine those two. And you have experience with combining things because you've paid attention to the way your own mind works. You've combined things in the past without even really knowing what you were doing. So by taking all of those pieces together, horse, horn, and combination, you can put them together and create the concept of a unicorn, even if you've never seen one. So Locke gives us, a theory of how sense experience is enough in order to learn everything that we actually know. Now, in order to make sense of this in the reading, we need to make sure we know his vocabulary. See, Locke calls the concepts of things that we have ideas. That is, the things in our head we call ideas, and the things out in the world that cause ideas are called qualities. So, like a red object, when we think about it, we're thinking about the idea of red, but redness out in the world is a quality. So you're not going to say that the concept of red is in the world, you're going to say the quality of red is in the world. And hopefully that'll help you piece together the reading a little bit better. But then Locke goes on to add a little more technical detail to all this. You see, qualities out in the world, according to Locke, come in two different kinds. There are primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are the actual property for the physical object, totally separate from human beings, would have. So like an object in a dark room just sitting on its own is going to have things like size and shape and hardness and texture and all those other lovely physical things. Those kind of physical properties are called primary qualities for Locke. Secondary qualities are the abilities of those objects to cause certain ideas and sensations in the mind, even when those don't exist in the object itself. And color really is one of the best examples of this. So take something like an apple. An apple has certain primary qualities. It has a certain size, a certain shape, contains a certain amount of water, and it also reflects light of a certain wavelength. And that's a physical quality that it has. It reflects light, visible light, electromagnetic radiation, in a certain spectrum, and it absorbs electromagnetic radiation of a certain other spectrum. Now these are all the primary qualities that an apple has. Notice that I've not said that an apple is red as one of those primary qualities, because redness isn't a thing that a physical object actually has. Redness is like a big, bold, bright sensation that human beings experience. That's not something that objects have. That's something that objects cause human beings to experience. So an apple doesn't have the quality of being red. It has the secondary quality of causing human beings to experience red. So secondary qualities are the abilities and the powers that an object or a thing has to cause ideas and sensations, that even if they don't exist in the actual object. And it's this kind of distinction in thinking, when people are trying to analyze what color is, what sight is, how does perception work, a lot of these things are old epistemology projects that have since gone delegated over to science. But this is why things like the dumb question, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make any sound, that actually used to be a legitimate philosophical question. Because what it is it's asking, what is sound? Is sound a physical thing, a thing actually existing out in the world separate from us, or is it totally in our own heads? If we use Locke's theory, you would say something like, well, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, it doesn't make a sound, because what it does is it makes physical vibrations. But sound is something that human beings experience. And we experience it because of the secondary qualities of a tree falling in the forest, of the secondary qualities of vibrations in the air. So this is why he actually goes to the lengths to explain this kind of thing. Locke is trying to explain in as much detail as he can, and try and give an explanation in as much detail as he can, of how it is we can come to learn everything we know about the world through nothing but sense experience. It's really pretty fascinating. And it helps explain why certain things were confusing to people in centuries past, and that maybe we still don't give enough thought to these things in current discussions and, the way we go about the world. So, that's where ideas come from. But what about all this knowledge stuff? Because so far Locke has been talking about his theory, but he's not actually said anything about knowledge yet, which sounds pretty weird in a unit all about knowledge. So then Locke goes on in another book to state that there are two degrees of knowledge. There's intuition and there's demonstration. If whatever it is you're talking about is a general kind of truth, like a big, broad, sweeping type of statement or generalization, and it's not one of those two things, well then according to Locke it's not actually knowledge. What it is just mere faith or opinion. You believe that that's so, you think that that's so, but you don't actually know. So, what are the two degrees of knowledge? Well, Locke says that one of them, the thing that we know more certainly than anything else, are the things that we know through intuition. And these are the ideas that you learn and know directly, with no middlemen, no intermediate concepts proving it to you. So, like, for example, when you look at the shapes on the left side of the screen, you can tell the difference between a triangle, a circle, and a square. You may not know the names, perhaps you really suck at geometry, or your parents never taught you shapes when you were little, or you had a strange, rare upbringing where you didn't learn the names of shapes as a child. Even if that's the case, just looking, you can tell that those three shapes are different. Nobody had to tell you that. Nobody had to prove that they're different. You just saw it. You saw it and you knew it. This is the kind of thing that Locke is naming intuition. It's direct knowledge with no intermediate steps. So when he talks about intuition, this is the kind of thing he's talking about. When he talks about demonstration in the reading, he's talking about using other concepts to link and prove ideas. So perhaps I told you that one of the shapes on your screen has no corners. And then I gave you the definition of a corner. I explained to you that it's where two lines come together at a certain angle that is less than 180 degrees. And then I tell you the circle is the one that has no corners. What I've done is I've given you a piece of knowledge. The circle is the one that has no corners. But I've proven it to you. I've used extra concepts to link the concept of a circle, a corner, and a circle has no corners. I've used concepts to link all these together. I've used some concepts as a bridge to join two other pieces of knowledge together. And these are the kinds of knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that Locke calls demonstration. So anytime in the reading he's talking about demonstration, He's talking about using some concepts to link and bridge to other concepts and gain knowledge according to that. Now, all of these concepts come from your sense experience, so it's still empiricism, according to Locke. But this is how we gain other pieces of knowledge we don't directly see. And this is the kind of thing like when I was talking about the unicorns a minute ago. You understanding what a unicorn is going to be something you know through demonstration, not through intuition. Now, demonstration is slightly less certain than intuition, but Locke still very much considers it knowledge. Now, there's one other thing besides these two that Locke considers knowledge, and that is our direct perceptions of individual finite things. You see, some things we perceive and know directly, but we're talking about general sweeping things, like we know the difference between a circle and a square. That's not talking about this thing we're seeing, we're talking about the big concepts. Like we know just directly, if you understand what I mean by circle and what I mean by square, you just think and immediately and directly understand. You just see that a circle is different from a square. But another thing that we directly know are the things that we are immediately and directly seeing through our senses of individual objects. You know, like, for example, you know right now, just by looking at it, there's a computer in front of you. This is a piece of knowledge, according to Locke. It's not just a belief or a bit of faith, and you know it because you're directly experiencing it. But you don't know it through intuition. It's not about concepts, and it's not about general truths. The fact that a computer is sitting in front of you is a specific truth. And this is something that normally you'd take a lot of demonstration to have to prove. You have to say, well, all computers occupy physical space, and there's, like, you start getting into a really complicated way of having to validly prove that. But you don't have to do any of that. You can know that there's a computer in front of you just by directly looking at it. And that's why Locke says that even though there are two degrees of knowledge, there's a third thing that still counts as knowledge, and that is directly experiencing something like right now. So, if any statement or fact or thought is not one of these three kinds of knowledge, Locke says it's nothing more than faith and opinion. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because Locke still believes that probability is very much a thing. Probability, he says, is just the appearance of certainty. It's how convincingly something can show you that it, is certain. And there's always a little bit of doubt involved, because these things aren't actual knowledge. But like, say that there's somebody in the next room, if you're not directly experiencing it right now, you don't know it, according to Locke. You don't know for certain that there is somebody in the next room. But you remember that there's somebody in the next room, and so it seems pretty certain. It appears certain to you that there's somebody in the next room. But it's not actually certain. There's still a little bit of doubt there. So Locke would call that a probable belief, or a probable bit of faith. But it's not actually knowledge. And you might have noticed by now that the unifying theme here is that for Locke, knowledge requires certainty. You see, that's going to be the defining feature of knowledge according to Locke and a lot of other empiricists. Not all, but a lot of empiricists are going to say that the defining feature of knowledge is certainty. And we kind of had this theme in Descartes as well. A common response to what is the defining feature of knowledge is that you have not just justified true belief, but you have so much justification that that true belief is absolutely certain. It's beyond all doubt. This is the kind of thing that Locke and others will call knowledge. Now, that pretty much sums up the Locke reading. Between the vocabulary and the overview, or the detailed overview I just gave you, you can pretty much understand everything in the Locke reading, so you need to make sure and go back and do that if you've not already. So I'm going to switch gears right now over to Hume. If you've got questions about Locke, this is probably the best place to pause the video. Make sure you write those questions down so you don't get confused as to who says what. Okay, you good? Let's move on to David Hume then. For the most part, Hume's theory is pretty similar to Locke's, which is good because we only get 2 pages of Hume's theory, so we don't get all the details that explain the really similar positions and just explanation of how knowledge works. Hume differs in terminology from Locke, like he uses idea instead of concept. He uses impression instead of sense experience or anything like that. So he uses slightly different words, but the ideas are pretty much the same. But there are two major differences between Hume and Locke. The first of these is that Hume does not talk about certainty much. Hume doesn't use certainty as a definition of knowledge. In fact, he really doesn't label knowledge as anything special at all. He just talks about beliefs. So, in this case, knowledge would be a type of belief, but Hume never gives it a special name or any special attention. He just talks about beliefs and things that you believe in general. Now, secondly, Hume also is an empiricist like Locke, but he takes this empiricism a lot further. And so actually Hume ends up being skeptical about things that Locke thinks are certain done deals. So, for example, Hume, just like Locke, argues that the only way we gain ideas is through sense impressions. So just like Locke, he's going to end up saying that even when you manipulate concepts in your mind, their original source was your sense experiences, your sensations, your impressions, according to Hume. But there are certain things that you know about that you never see. Now for Locke, that includes things like unicorns and the like, and you figure those out by putting certain ideas together and creating those connections, and so on and so forth. But Hume is such a hardcore believer that the only source of your ideas are your sense impressions, that if you don't directly experience it, then there's pretty good reason to think that you don't know anything about that thing. You might believe certain things, but you really don't know it. So, for example, we don't know, or we never actually directly experience causation. And by causation, I mean like the activity of one thing causing another, like cause and effect type stuff. So like if you're playing pool, and this is actually an example that Hume talks about, he loved pool. If you're playing pool, and you use the cue ball to slam into the 8 ball, for example, the plain white ball slams into the black 8 ball trying to score some points. You hit the ball with a stick, the cue ball slams into the 8 ball, and the 8 ball starts moving. Well, according to Hume, you never actually see the cue ball, the white ball, causing the 8 ball to move. What you actually see is the white ball moves, a sound happens, and then the 8 ball starts moving. And these things happen in sequence. They happen in order. But you never actually see causation. Because causation is not an object. It's not a thing you can experience, according to Hume. Therefore, all you really see are these 3 events happening in sequence. And they happen together so often that your lazy-ass brain just connects the 3. It automatically assumes that these 3 are connected, when technically they're just happening in order at the same time. Because the reason why that's a problem, according to Hume, is that things happen together all the time that are not connected. Like, suppose that every time you went to the bathroom, your best friend played an air horn right next to you. And suppose that, for whatever reason, you've grown up with this person, they've been doing it your entire life. You go to the bathroom, an air horn sounds. Technically, there is no actual connection between those two events. You going to the bathroom does not cause the sound of an air horn to happen. If you going to the bathroom actually causes an air horn to blow, you should probably see a doctor about that right away. You've got something horribly, horribly wrong with your gastrointestinal system. For most of us, those two things are not connected. But if you saw them happening enough over time, they're together all the time, you might start to assume that they might be connected. And I suppose the friend playing it would be a bad example, because your friend blowing the air horn might actually be caused by it. He might be thinking it's funny. But there are all sorts of other connections that are a little bit crazier. People in more superstitious cultures, or in, I say more superstitious, not necessarily in a bad way, but then they have more beliefs about the supernatural than a lot of others. They'll start to see things like, well, if I make this symbol with my hands, tigers don't attack me. Well, that doesn't actually mean that there's any connection between doing your hand a certain way and not being attacked by tigers. If I wake up in a bed in Texas, I don't get attacked by a tiger anytime I've ever woken up in Texas. In fact, anytime I've ever woken up at all, I have never been attacked by a tiger. That doesn't mean that waking up is an effective tiger repellent. It just means that these two things have been happening coincidentally my entire life. So, human beings have an unfortunate tendency, though, to see these two coincidental things as connected. And Hume points this out even in the case of such small, ordinary things as one cause leading to an effect. We never actually experience causation. We just experience things happening side by side. But because we see them happening side by side, we start to assume that causation's a thing. And because it's nothing more than an assumption, Hume says, we really don't have evidence that it's a real thing. We should actually be skeptical as to whether causation exists at all, or whether there's just random events happening and we just try sorting the chaos into an actual organized pattern. Similarly, Hume's a skeptic about whether or not the external world exists. Because technically, you have no experience of things you're not looking at. So like say, most of you probably have a microwave at home. Most of you also probably are not looking at that microwave right now. So technically, according to Hume, you don't have any evidence that that microwave exists right now. Perhaps it disappeared the instant you turned away from it last. You have no reason to think otherwise. You think you do. You think you know that there's a microwave in your house somewhere, but you don't actually have any real justification for that. So, according to Hume, you should be skeptical about it. And so maybe you start to see how an extreme form of empiricism can actually lead to skepticism about certain key and fundamental concepts. And for a lot of people that causes a problem, but overall, those points, those views, are empiricism in a nutshell. So we have to start to evaluate it. Do these views hold water? Or, that's just a way of saying, are they actually consistent? Are they worth considering? Is this the right way to look at knowledge? And to answer this, we have to do our usual sorts of evaluating things. The usual sorts of questions we ask at this point when considering philosophy. We have to ask ourselves, are there any mistakes in the views? That is, in the case of Locke, are there any ideas, that we're actually born with? Are we born with inborn notions of space and time, or sequence, or perfection, or degrees of things? Are there any ideas that we are born with? Are there things that we're justified in knowing about that don't come from experience? Are we justified in believing things like unicorns, or causation, or the external world? We also have to ask, do these empiricist views actually adequately answer skepticism? So think back about the challenges that Descartes raised in the first part of his reading. Perhaps you're dreaming or hallucinating. Perhaps you don't actually know anything about the real world at all. If empiricism can't answer those kinds of questions, then even if empiricism is perfectly coherent, we really probably shouldn't endorse empiricism. In order to be a solid theory of knowledge, it needs to have some way of refuting the views of skepticism. Skepticism is way too easy to prove right. So, if you're going to have some sort of a view of knowledge, it needs to be able to answer the challenges of skepticism. And then another thing I'd like you to consider is whether or not Hume is justified in his version of skeptical empiricism. Because Hume seems to have some pretty good points there. Hume's a very common sense kind of guy. And so when he says, when you aren't looking at your microwave, you don't know for a fact it continues to exist, or you never actually directly experience causation, he's kind of got a point there. You never actually see or have proof of some of these things. Yet, most of us still think that we're justified in believing in them. We very much still believe in causation. We very much think we know that one thing causes another. If you didn't, you would probably get run over by a bus at some point, because you would be, skeptical as to whether or not a bus leads to a trip to the hospital. And while Hume thought, obviously people still believe these things and they should, he was just trying to stress that they weren't knowledge and that you should be skeptical about them. But that kind of skepticism is a very high theoretical cost. Remember early on when we talked about if a belief or a position implies a false belief and you've got reason to reject it? Well, this is one of those things still involved with Hume's positions. Hume's views imply that we don't know a few things that we generally assume we know pretty well. So if we have to abandon those bits of knowledge, that's a pretty high cost to his view. It has to be weighed against the kind of benefits it has. And then finally, if none of these views have done it for you, if Descartes raised some pretty good skeptical questions, and his view sounded pretty crazy, and Locke and Hume just weren't satisfying in any way, well, there's still an answer. We're still going to look at something regarding an answer to skepticism, and that is the work of G.E. Moore. You've got the reading listed on your syllabus. Moore gives a very common sense solution to skepticism that I think a lot of you might find at the very least interesting, if not flat out entertaining or fascinating. So, look forward to that. Consider these questions, and happy thinking.